The room went silent so fast it felt like oxygen got pulled out of the Capitol itself. One question. No wiggle room. No speechwriter's exit ramp. If America went to war with Somalia, who do you want to win? Cameras tightened, seconds stretched, and a politician who'd sparred for hours suddenly couldn't form a single safe sentence. That silence didn't just answer, it detonated. The hearing did not begin with shouting, interruptions, or theatrical outrage. It began with a stillness that felt intentional, almost engineered, as if the room itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. When Speaker Mike Johnson took his seat at the head of the House Ethics Committee table, there was no sense that this was another partisan skirmish designed for cable news. The atmosphere was restrained, procedural, and unnervingly calm. This was not a spectacle looking for applause. This was a process moving toward a conclusion. Ilhan Omar entered the room believing she knew the script. For 6 hours, she had already done what seasoned politicians do best under pressure: deflect, contextualize, moralize, and reframe. She labeled the hearing a witch hunt, dismissed it as political theater, and framed herself as a familiar target of ideological persecution. Her tone shifted between confidence and boredom, as though endurance alone would carry her through. What she did not anticipate was a question designed not to provoke debate, but to eliminate escape. Mike Johnson did not posture like a man chasing viral clips. His voice remained level, clinical, and precise. The cadence of someone trained to think in evidence rather than outrage. When he asked whether Omar would want the United States or Somalia to win in a hypothetical war, it was not framed as an attack. It was framed as a test. A binary question stripped of nuance, ideology, and rhetorical shelter. The kind of question that forces clarity, not commentary. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was crushing. Seconds passed, then more, until the absence of an answer became the loudest thing in the room. Cameras captured every micro-expression as Omar glanced toward her attorney, searching for an objection that never arrived. Her hands tightened on the edge of the table, her posture stiffening as the implications of any response became unavoidable. In the world of live television, a minute of silence is not empty time. It is exposure. Everyone present understood the stakes immediately. This was not about foreign policy preferences or abstract critiques of American power. It was about allegiance, oath, and the legal meaning of citizenship. The question did not ask Omar to explain herself. It asked her to choose. And in that choice, or refusal to make one, the entire hearing found its center of gravity. The setting amplified the gravity of the moment. The hearing room was filled beyond capacity, with reporters lining the walls and members of Congress standing where chairs had run out. Democrats had boycotted the proceeding, dismissing it as illegitimate, a decision that now carried unintended consequences. Their absence did not weaken the hearing's authority. It removed distraction. What remained felt less like a political arena and more like a courtroom. Johnson had not come to perform. Behind him stood easels with charts, timelines, and photographs introduced methodically over the course of the day. On the table before him lay binders, thick and meticulously organized, color-coded to separate financial records, communications, voting patterns, and witness testimony. He did not rush. He did not interrupt unnecessarily. He allowed the material to speak, confident that accumulation would do what accusation could not. Omar, by contrast, had arrived prepared for confrontation. Her attire was chosen for the cameras, her language calibrated for supporters who expected defiance. She had survived intense criticism before, including attacks on her faith and character, and each time she had emerged politically stronger. That history reinforced a belief that this hearing would follow the same arc. It would escalate, polarize, and ultimately validate her narrative of resistance. What she failed to see was that Johnson was not trying to defeat her narrative. He was bypassing it entirely. When Johnson broke the silence after the unanswered question, he did not raise his voice. He reframed the issue by returning to the oath Omar took when she became a citizen, reading it slowly and deliberately. The words were familiar, but in this context, they carried a weight that could not be abstracted away. Renouncing all allegiance to foreign states is not symbolic language. It is explicit. It leaves little room for interpretation when examined under scrutiny. This was the structure of the hearing from the start. Johnson did not accuse Omar of motives or beliefs. He presented actions, records, and statements attributed to her, and then asked whether those actions aligned with the legal obligations of her office. Each section built on the previous one, forming a chain that did not depend on outrage to hold together. The question of loyalty was not rhetorical. It was procedural. The opening hours of the hearing revealed a sharp contrast in strategy. Omar and her team relied on narrative framing, assuming that identity-based defenses would override technical arguments. Johnson relied on sequencing, allowing evidence to accumulate before narrowing the focus. Where Omar sought to broaden the conversation into ideology, Johnson narrowed it toward law. That divergence defined everything that followed. As the day progressed, it became clear that the hearing was not designed to corner Omar emotionally, but to limit her options legally. Every potential response carried consequences, not because of optics, but because of prior statements and documented interactions already entered into the record. The simplicity of the final question was intentional. It was asked only after complexity had been exhausted. By the time the silence arrived, the outcome no longer depended on what Omar might say. The silence itself functioned as a conclusion, filling the space left by an answer that could not safely exist. Johnson did not need to declare victory. The hearing had already shifted from inquiry to reckoning. This was not a story about ideology clashing with patriotism, nor about dissent versus conformity. It was about the collision between personal identity and institutional obligation. The hearing forced a confrontation between narrative politics and legal reality, and only one of those frameworks was built to survive sustained examination. From the opening gavel to the unanswered question, the direction was clear. What unfolded next would not be decided by slogans, tweets, or applause lines. It would be shaped by documents, testimony, and the uncompromising language of oath and statute. The opening moments made one thing unmistakable. This was not a hearing designed to wound. It was a hearing designed to conclude. The first substantive turn of the hearing unfolded without fireworks, but the tension was unmistakable. Mike Johnson did not rush into accusation or ideology. He began by anchoring the proceeding in process, jurisdiction, and scope. He reminded the room that the committee was not convened to debate political beliefs, but to examine conduct that might intersect with federal law. That framing mattered because it narrowed the battlefield before a single document was introduced. From the outset, the rules of engagement were legal, not rhetorical. Ilhan Omar listened with a practiced stillness that suggested confidence rather than concern. She had prepared for confrontation, not for methodical exposure. Her counsel sat close, whispering occasionally, tracking Johnson's cadence for any procedural misstep that might justify an objection. None came. The calmness of the opening did not signal weakness, it signaled control. Johnson transitioned seamlessly into the first evidenti lane, campaign finance. He spoke in round numbers, then refined them, moving from totals to subsets to patterns. Contributions were described as disclosed, lawful on their face, and compliant in isolation, a concession that disarmed early resistance. Only after establishing that baseline did he introduce the connective tissue between donors, intermediaries, and foreign-linked institutions. The shift was subtle but deliberate. Omar responded with language she had used many times before, emphasizing compliance systems and third-party vetting. Her tone was firm, bordering on dismissive, as if the matter were routine. Johnson did not challenge her credibility directly. Instead, he asked whether she was aware of certain relationships underpinning the donations. Awareness, not guilt, became the operative word. That distinction boxed her in without accusing her of intent. As documents appeared on the screens behind him, the room's energy shifted perceptibly. Flow charts traced money across borders through organizations that were legally domestic, yet financially entangled with foreign interests. Johnson narrated the diagrams slowly, giving viewers time to follow each step. He did not embellish, and he did not editorialize. The implication arose from structure, not tone. Omar's counsel objected to characterization, but Johnson accepted the objection only to restate the facts more precisely. He emphasized that the committee was examining patterns, not isolated acts. Timing became the focus, with donations clustered around election cycles and legislative moments. The repetition of that rhythm did more work than any single allegation could have done. When Johnson pivoted to the subject of Omar's household finances, the atmosphere tightened again. He clarified that the inquiry was not personal, but relevant to disclosure and influence. Payments to a consulting entity connected to her spouse were introduced as reported income, not hidden assets. The question posed was simple: what services were rendered? Omar bristled, asserting separation between her official duties and her family's private business. Johnson acknowledged the principle, then returned to documentation. Contracts, deliverables, and identifiable work products were discussed in neutral terms. The absence of detail, rather than the presence of accusation, became the focal point. Silence filled the gaps where specificity should have been. Charts comparing payment dates to legislative actions appeared next. Johnson walked the committee through each instance carefully, emphasizing that correlation alone was not proof. He repeated that phrase, almost defensively, as if anticipating criticism. Then he added that repeated correlation demands explanation. The word pattern returned, heavier each time it was used. Omar attempted to reframe the exchange as conjecture built on coincidence. Johnson did not argue with her. He simply asked whether she disputed the dates or the amounts. She did not. The distinction between disputing interpretation and disputing fact became increasingly stark. Viewers watching closely could sense the narrowing corridor of viable responses. The hearing then shifted into its second major lane: communications. Johnson acknowledged that members of Congress routinely speak with foreign officials, especially when advocating for constituents. He described such contact as normal, even necessary, in a globalized political environment. That acknowledgement blunted any immediate claim of impropriety. Only then did he separate routine exchanges from those flagged as unusual. The number of documented contacts was introduced without drama. Johnson cited totals, then subsets, then categories. Calls, meetings, and messages were described in aggregate before being differentiated by subject matter. He was careful to note that not all communications were problematic. The distinction hinged on content, not frequency alone. Transcripts were referenced, not sensationalized. Johnson explained that classified materials could not be discussed publicly, but declassified summaries were available. He emphasized that the committee was relying on lawful processes and authorized disclosures. Each safeguard was mentioned explicitly, reinforcing legitimacy. The hearing felt procedural because it was. Omar's demeanor changed subtly as the focus moved from money to messages. Confidence gave way to calculation. Her responses became shorter, more cautious, as if each word were weighed for downstream consequences. Johnson noticed, but did not comment. He allowed the tension to grow organically. When audio excerpts were introduced, Johnson prefaced them with context and limitations. He reminded the room that recordings capture moments, not entire relationships. That caveat, paradoxically, strengthened their impact. The words played were not framed as definitive proof, but as evidence requiring reconciliation with public statements. The burden of explanation shifted quietly onto Omar. Her counsel objected again, this time on relevance. Johnson responded by tying the content directly to legislative activity and oversight responsibilities. He did not argue motive, he argued jurisdiction. The committee, he said, had an obligation to examine whether information flowed appropriately. The objection fell flat, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was anticipated. The third evidenti lane emerged gradually: voting patterns. Johnson did not accuse Omar of disloyalty through her votes. He acknowledged that dissenting votes are part of representative democracy. Instead, he juxtaposed timing, communication, and financial context. The implication was not that a vote was wrong, but that its alignment demanded scrutiny. Omar attempted to contextualize her votes within broader policy positions. She spoke about humanitarian concerns, skepticism of sanctions, and the complexity of international engagement. Johnson did not dispute her philosophy. He simply asked whether those explanations accounted for the sequence of events presented. The question lingered unanswered. By the time witnesses were called, the room was already primed for a different kind of testimony. These were not experts or operatives, but constituents. Johnson introduced them with care, emphasizing their backgrounds and credibility. He stressed that their presence was voluntary. The narrative shifted from documents to lived experience. The first witness spoke plainly, without flourish. Her testimony was not dramatic, but it was specific. She described conversations that framed identity and loyalty in ways that unsettled her. Johnson asked clarifying questions, not leading ones. The authenticity of the exchange came from its restraint. Omar watched silently as the witness spoke. Her earlier confidence did not return. The accusations now came not from political opponents, but from members of her own community. That shift carried a different weight. The hearing moved from abstract concerns to personal trust. When recordings were played, Johnson reiterated their legal basis and limits. He did not claim they captured Omar's entire worldview. He presented them as evidence of statements that needed reconciliation with sworn obligations. The contrast between public rhetoric and private language became unavoidable. Silence again filled the room. As the witness testimony concluded, Johnson summarized without embellishment. He did not declare guilt or innocence. He outlined the questions that now stood before the committee. Each question pointed back to the oath, the law, and the responsibilities of office. The architecture of the case was visible now, not as an ambush, but as an accumulation. By the time Johnson returned to Omar for further questioning, the hearing had changed character. It was no longer exploratory, it was clarifying. The room understood that the remaining hours would not introduce surprises, but resolve contradictions. The trajectory was set. Omar attempted to regain narrative control by invoking broader themes of persecution and bias. Johnson did not dismiss those concerns outright. He acknowledged the reality of discrimination in American politics. Then he drew a firm line between identity-based attacks and evidence-based inquiry. The distinction was sharp, and it held. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue set in, but focus remained. Johnson's questions became fewer and more pointed. He circled repeatedly back to allegiance, obligation, and truthfulness, and each return tightened the framework. The final question, still hours away, was already taking shape. By the time the committee recessed briefly, observers understood that the hearing was not drifting. It was converging. Every document, every testimony, every measured exchange was pulling toward a single point of resolution. The unanswered question loomed over the room like an approaching verdict. When the committee reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted from inquiry to inevitability. The earlier hours had laid a foundation that no longer needed reinforcement through repetition or escalation. What remained was alignment. Mike Johnson understood that the remaining time was not about introducing new material, but about forcing coherence between what had already been entered into the record and the obligations Ilhan Omar had sworn to uphold. The room sensed that the hearing was entering its final phase, even though the clock still showed hours to go. Johnson resumed with a tone that was almost conversational, a marked contrast to the weight of what he was saying. He asked Omar to revisit her naturalization ceremony not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a factual checkpoint. The date, the location, the language of the oath were all recited slowly, deliberately. Each element was presented as something Omar herself would recognize, something she could not plausibly dispute. This was not a trap built on surprise. It was a corridor narrowing by design. Omar responded carefully, her earlier sharpness replaced by guarded precision. She acknowledged the oath, affirmed its importance, and emphasized her belief in the Constitution. Johnson did not challenge those statements. Instead, he juxtaposed them with excerpts from prior testimony, recordings, and communications already discussed. The contrast was not framed as contradiction, but as tension. He asked whether she believed both sets of statements could coexist without conflict. That question lingered unanswered longer than most. Omar's counsel whispered urgently, but no objection followed. The committee members remained silent, watching the exchange with the stillness of jurors rather than politicians. Johnson allowed the pause to stretch, not out of cruelty, but out of confidence that the silence itself was instructive. When Omar finally spoke, her answer circled the issue without touching it directly, invoking complexity and lived experience. Johnson acknowledged complexity, then returned to specificity. He reminded her that the oath did not contain qualifiers or exemptions. It did not ask for partial allegiance or contextual loyalty. Its language was absolute by design. He read the relevant line again, slower this time, emphasizing the phrase, "without mental reservation." The words hung in the air, no longer abstract, but accusatory in their simplicity. As the hearing progressed, Johnson methodically addressed the implications of the evidence without declaring conclusions. He explained the legal frameworks that governed foreign influence, campaign finance, and classified information. Each explanation was dry, procedural, and devoid of theatricality. That dryness made it harder to dismiss the discussion as partisan theater. It sounded less like a speech and more like a brief. Omar attempted once more to reframe the proceedings as an attack on dissent. She spoke about her criticism of American foreign policy, her advocacy for marginalized communities, and her willingness to challenge consensus. Johnson did not dispute her right to dissent. He explicitly affirmed it. Then he drew a line between dissent and disclosure, between advocacy and coordination. The distinction was narrow but firm, and it held. Witness testimony resumed briefly, not to introduce new allegations, but to clarify earlier statements. Each witness spoke in restrained terms, careful not to exaggerate or editorialize. Their consistency mattered more than their emotion. Johnson asked questions that invited elaboration rather than confirmation, allowing the record to fill itself out organically. Omar watched, increasingly withdrawn, as the narrative solidified around her rather than radiating outward. By late afternoon, the committee had exhausted its evidenti presentation. What remained was synthesis. Johnson summarized the day's material without flourish, grouping facts into categories rather than accusations. Financial interactions, communications, legislative timing, and public statements were recapped as elements requiring reconciliation. He emphasized repeatedly that the committee was not declaring guilt, but identifying concerns serious enough to warrant referral. Then he returned, calmly and deliberately, to the question that had first fractured the room. He explained why it mattered, not as a hypothetical about war, but as a measure of allegiance. The question was not about personal identity or heritage. It was about the legal and ethical expectations placed on someone entrusted with national authority. The framing was precise, almost surgical. Johnson acknowledged that the question was uncomfortable. He conceded that it forced a choice many would prefer not to articulate. Then he noted that discomfort does not negate obligation. For elected officials, clarity is not optional. It is foundational. The committee, he said, was entitled to an answer not because it demanded loyalty tests, but because the Constitution requires them. When he asked the question again, the room seemed to contract inward. Omar looked down, then up, then toward her counsel. Her posture stiffened, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The cameras captured every movement, every hesitation. Seconds passed, then more. The silence returned, heavier than before, no longer surprising, but final. Johnson did not interrupt. He did not repeat the question. He waited, understanding that anything he said would dilute the moment. When it became clear that no answer was forthcoming, he noted the refusal for the record in a neutral tone. There was no judgment in his voice, only documentation. The effect was devastating precisely because it was understated. From there, the procedural consequences followed swiftly, but without spectacle. Johnson outlined the committee's intended actions, framing them as referrals rather than punishments. Each referral was explained in terms of jurisdiction and process, not outcome. He emphasized that investigations would proceed independently, according to established law. The committee, he said, was fulfilling its duty, not passing sentence. Omar reacted with visible distress, her composure finally cracking under the weight of the moment. She attempted to speak, to reclaim narrative ground, but Johnson brought the proceedings back to order firmly. The structure of the hearing no longer allowed for speeches. It allowed only for conclusions drawn from the record. The shift was unmistakable. As the gavel fell to adjourn the hearing, the room remained silent. There was no applause, no outburst, no immediate reaction. The absence of noise underscored the gravity of what had just occurred. This was not a victory lap or a political ambush. It was an ending, quiet and irreversible. In the aftermath, the consequences unfolded with relentless speed. Clips of the unanswered questions circulated widely, not because of commentary, but because of their starkness. Analysts debated implications, lawyers parsed language, and political allies struggled to respond. The silence became a symbol, interpreted and reinterpreted across platforms, but always rooted in the same unresolved moment. Institutional responses followed, measured and procedural. Statements were issued that acknowledged the seriousness of the allegations without presuming outcomes. Distancing language replaced solidarity. Caution replaced outrage. The machinery of accountability moved forward not with a roar, but with a steady hum. The hearing had done what it was designed to do: trigger processes larger than itself. For Omar, the shift was immediate and isolating. The defenses that had served her in prior controversies no longer applied cleanly. This was not about rhetoric or optics. It was about records and reconciliation. The narrative terrain she once commanded had narrowed to legal corridors she could not easily navigate. For the broader political landscape, the hearing marked a recalibration. It demonstrated a method of inquiry that did not rely on spectacle, but on accumulation. It showed that silence, when engineered through structure rather than intimidation, could be more powerful than accusation. The lesson was unmistakable to those watching closely. By the time the chamber emptied and the cameras powered down, the outcome felt settled, even if the formal processes were just beginning. The hearing had not destroyed a career through insult or outrage. It had done something far more enduring. It had exposed an unresolved contradiction and left it standing in full view. The main body of the story concluded not with a declaration, but with an absence. A question unanswered, a record complete, and an oath recited without resolution. In that space, the audience was left to confront the same choice posed to the witness: clarity or evasion, allegiance or ambiguity. The hearing offered no escape from that reckoning, only a mirror held steady until the image could no longer be ignored. The hearing did not end with a verdict, a declaration, or a moral flourish, and that absence was not accidental. What unfolded was not designed to tell the audience what to think, but to force them to confront the implications of what they had just witnessed. The committee did not claim to resolve questions of guilt or innocence, and it did not pretend that loyalty can always be measured cleanly or easily. Instead, it exposed a tension that modern politics often prefers to blur rather than examine. That tension now sits unresolved, waiting for judgment beyond the walls of the hearing room. At its core, the proceeding asked a deceptively simple question about allegiance, but it did so in a way that stripped the concept of its comforting abstractions. Allegiance was not discussed as identity, heritage, or emotional attachment, but as a legal commitment with concrete consequences. The oath was treated not as ceremonial language, but as an operational promise that carries weight when tested. That framing unsettled many observers precisely because it left so little room for interpretive comfort. When words are taken seriously, silence becomes meaningful. The hearing also challenged the assumption that political accountability must always look theatrical to be effective. There were no viral insults, no shouted exchanges, no moments crafted for applause. The power of the proceeding came from its restraint, from the cumulative pressure of facts placed methodically into the record. In that environment, outrage would have weakened the case rather than strengthened it. What remained was a stark contrast between narrative defense and procedural scrutiny. For supporters of Ilhan Omar, the discomfort was immediate and complex. Many saw in her story reflections of their own journeys, struggles, and identities, and that connection did not evaporate simply because questions were raised. The hearing did not deny those experiences or diminish their legitimacy. It instead forced a separation between representation as symbolism and representation as responsibility. That separation is painful precisely because it asks supporters to distinguish between empathy and endorsement. For critics, the moment carried its own risks. The temptation to treat the hearing as vindication or conquest was evident, but the process itself resisted that framing. By refusing to indulge in overt triumphalism, the committee implicitly acknowledged the gravity of what it was addressing. This was not about winning a political argument, but about testing the integrity of institutional safeguards. The absence of celebration underscored the seriousness of that task. The unresolved silence at the center of the hearing became its most enduring image because it refused closure. It did not confirm a narrative of betrayal, nor did it validate claims of persecution. Instead, it created a vacuum that demanded interpretation. Viewers were left to decide what silence signifies when speech carries consequences in every direction. In that sense, the hearing transferred responsibility from the witness to the public. This transfer of responsibility is uncomfortable in a media environment conditioned to consume conclusions rather than processes. Audiences are often trained to expect a final answer, a clear hero or villain, a resolution that absolves them of further thought. The hearing offered none of that. It insisted that civic judgment cannot always be outsourced to institutions alone. Sometimes, the hardest work begins after the gavel falls. The broader implications extend beyond any single individual or case. The hearing raised questions about how democratic systems handle the intersection of global identity and national obligation. In an interconnected world, dual affiliations are common, and transnational engagement is often necessary. The challenge lies in determining where engagement ends and obligation begins. That boundary is not always clear, but it cannot be ignored without consequence. The proceeding also illuminated the fragile balance between dissent and duty. Democracies depend on robust criticism, especially of foreign policy, which by its nature involves moral ambiguity and unintended consequences. At the same time, democracies depend on trust that those entrusted with power will not blur lines that safeguard national interests. The hearing did not claim that criticism itself is disloyal. It asked whether criticism can coexist with commitments that are absolute by design. What made the moment resonate was not the specificity of the allegations, but the universality of the question posed. The hypothetical scenario was never about an actual war, nor about choosing violence over peace. It was a stress test applied to the concept of allegiance itself. When forced into clarity, where does one stand and why? That question unsettles because it resists easy moral packaging. The neutrality of the tone throughout the conclusion of the hearing was itself a statement. By avoiding emotionally charged language, the committee signaled confidence in the process rather than the outcome. It suggested that truth, if it exists, does not require embellishment to surface. This approach invites trust precisely because it refrains from demanding it. Trust becomes a choice rather than a reaction. For institutions, the hearing served as a reminder that accountability mechanisms must function even when politically inconvenient. Oversight loses credibility when it appears selective or performative. By adhering closely to procedure and evidence, the committee attempted to demonstrate that standards apply regardless of profile or symbolism. Whether that attempt succeeds will be judged over time, not in headlines. For the public, the challenge is more personal. The hearing asked viewers to consider what they expect from those who represent them, beyond alignment on issues or shared identity. It asked whether symbolic representation is sufficient when legal and ethical obligations are at stake. It asked whether silence in the face of a direct question is acceptable, understandable, or disqualifying. These are not questions that institutions can answer alone. The absence of a definitive conclusion is not a weakness of the story, but its point. By refusing to tell the audience what to think, the ending respects the complexity of democratic judgment. It acknowledges that reasonable people may reach different conclusions based on the same set of facts. What it does not allow is indifference. The question lingers precisely because it demands engagement. As the political cycle moves on and new controversies compete for attention, the moment risks being reduced to a clip or a talking point. Yet its significance lies in what it reveals about the standards we are willing to enforce and the ambiguities we are willing to tolerate. The hearing did not ask for unanimity. It asked for seriousness. It asked whether words like oath, allegiance, and duty still carry enforceable meaning. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the hearing is not what was said, but what was left unsaid. Silence can be an act of restraint, a shield, or a confession, depending on context. In this case, it functioned as a mirror held up to the audience, reflecting back their own assumptions and priorities. The hearing closed without telling anyone which interpretation to choose. That unresolved tension now belongs to the public discourse, where it will be debated, reframed, and contested. It will be invoked by those who see it as proof of institutional vigilance, and by those who see it as an overreach cloaked in procedure. Both sides will claim principle, and both will argue necessity. The absence of a final answer ensures that the argument does not end neatly. The story, therefore, concludes not with certainty, but with responsibility. Responsibility to consider evidence without surrendering to outrage, and responsibility to defend principles without weaponizing them. It asks whether allegiance is something that can be contextualized indefinitely, or whether there are moments when clarity is non-negotiable. It asks whether silence should be interpreted as caution or avoidance, and so the question remains, not for the committee, not for the witness, but for everyone watching. When an oath demands absolute clarity, and the moment arrives to affirm it without qualification, is refusing to answer an act of integrity, an act of self-preservation, or an answer in itself.